I'm really pleased to be here. And the title that's in the program is fairly all-encompassing in terms of how feeding cows energy supplements might influence milk composition and have implications for cheese quality. So what I'm going to try to focus on, and partly because Bronwyn asked me some questions about the effects of feeding a particular type of protected fat, rumen protected fat, on cheese quality, I'm going to focus on the effects of supplemental fat and their potential implications. So I work at the Center for Dairy Research at the University of Reading. I don't know if any of you know of us or have visited before, but we're just south of the M4 at the A33. We farm about 1,500 acres there. We milk about 560 cows and a year-round calving system. It's a fairly intensive production system. We're averaging about 10,600 liters sold per cow per year in that system. We're very dry there. You should see us now. Whoever decided to put a dairy farm there should have their head examined because we cannot grow grass in the summertime. Our soils are just too gravelly and free draining. So we rely a lot on conserved forages and supplements for feeding our cows. At Reading, we've got a long history. We were established in 1992, the Center for Dairy Research. We've got a long history of research on effects of diet on milk composition, and we've done a lot of work for various reasons, which I'll go into in just a minute, on the effects of feeding fat on milk composition. One of our main areas of research is meat and milk from animals and their effects on human health. So we're looking at what's good about milk and what's bad about milk for human health and what we can do about it. And that is the reason we do a lot of work on feeding fats to cows. So why would we want to feed fat to dairy cows? By the way, I'm a ruminant nutritionist. My area of research is feeding cows. So I'm finding artisan cheese is very fascinating. But we would feed fat to cows. Primarily in the past, we've fed fat to dairy cows to increase their energy intake. Fat is more energy dense than a carbohydrate, and so it can bring more digestible energy into the diet for the cow. And we can then add more fat to the diet without increasing the amount of starch. Okay, there's a lot of concerns about feeding starch. So if we add fat to the diet, it doesn't reduce the amount of forage in the diet, and so it's more healthy in terms of the rumen environment. This had primarily historically been done to increase milk yield, but also there's a lot of interest in feeding fat in early lactation to try to reduce the amount of body energy, the amount of body condition or body fat a cow might mobilize in early lactation to meet the energy requirements of milk yield. And so there's a lot of fat supplements that are fed or that are sold to farmers to feed with the aim of trying to reduce body energy loss in early lactation. And one of the messages today is that it doesn't always work. It depends on the type of fat and the composition of the fat that you feed. And there's a lot of supplements that are also targeted at improving fertility. Historically, farmers have also fed fat supplements to change milk fat concentration. Either to, 25 years ago when I came to Cedar, people were feeding fish oil to cows because they were over quota on fat. So fish oil is very effective at reducing milk fat concentration. And so dairy farmers who had got over their quota were trying to reduce the fat concentration of their milk. And fish oil is very good at doing that. Other fat supplements, and nowadays we have high palmitic acid supplements that are very effective at increasing milk fat concentration. Supplements like Butter Booster, okay? And they're primarily palm fatty acids, C16-0, a saturated fatty acid, and they're very effective at raising milk fat concentration. And then the other reason would be to change milk fat composition. Not the total amount of fat, but the composition of that fat, the fatty acids that are in that milk fat that your cows are producing. Historically, this has been done for potentially to change the processing characteristics of the milk. For example, and I'll show you a picture of this in a minute, softer butter that spreads straight from the fridge that's produced by cows fed rapeseed. Okay, that milk has had its fatty acid composition changed so that the butter's more spreadable. Consumer preference is another big reason, and there's a lot of interest in feeding cows in a way that makes the milk fat more healthy. And one of the big issues here is saturated fatty acid concentration of milk. Milk's very high in saturated fatty acids, and we've done a lot of work over the years looking at ways to feed cows to reduce the saturated fatty acids in the milk. We have to replace those fats with another type of fatty acid, and so we're usually increasing the amount of unsaturated fats. That's usually oleic acid or something like linoleic acid. And a lot of these are coming from oil seeds. Alpha-linolenic acid is a C18-3 fatty acid. It's an omega fatty acid, and we hear a lot about healthiness of omega fatty acids or M-3 fatty acids. And alpha-linolenic acid is very high in grass. And there's a lot of interest in the effects of grazing and effects of free-range production systems on the healthiness of milk. And that's also tied to organic production systems. There's been a lot in the news about the effects of organic systems on milk fatty acid composition, and it's related to the way the cows are fed. And I'll show you some slides in a minute that show how grazing or summer feeding of cows changes the milk fatty acid profile. And we've known about this for 100 years, how these types of dietary interventions affects milk fat concentration. And there have historically been a lot of products that have been put on the market that have been labeled for having altered fatty acid profile because they are perceived to be more healthy. The omega-3 enriched milks that were on the market a few years ago are a good example. Now, some of those milks were produced by feeding cows fish oil, but it's really hard to get those fish oil fatty acids through the rumen without being changed and into the milk. So one of the products that was on the market just had the fish oil added directly to the milk after harvest, okay? And it's just the way it works. The other that you may not be aware of is Marks and Spencer's, and some of their Simply More products, their Plan A milk products. I don't know if any of you are Marks and Spencer's providers. Any of you sell to Marks and Spencer's? The Marks and Spencer's pool was paid initially an extra 2p a liter for keeping the saturated fatty acid concentration of their milk below 70%. And so it was effectively trying to keep milk like summer milk all year round. And they had to do it in the wintertime by feeding supplemental fats, okay? They never labeled the milk as being reduced saturated fatty acid milk. They just did it because they felt like it was the right thing to do. And we worked a lot with Marks and Spencer's in developing that. So again, I've already referred to some of the different types of fatty acids that are present in milk. Just again, milk is largely saturated fatty acids, okay? So again, Marks and Spencer's were paying their producers to keep their milk under this 70% ceiling. And that's largely the medium chain fatty acids. So the 12 to 16 carbon fatty acids. And palmitate is the saturated fatty acid that's present in the largest amount in typical cow's milk. So the remainder is mostly unsaturated fatty acids. Well, it's unsaturated fatty acids. It's mostly monounsaturated fatty acids. And this is largely C18-1 or oleic acid. But it also includes some trans fatty acids. And you hear a lot about these as well. And these are produced as part of the hydrogenation of the C18-2 and the C18-3 and the other longer chain polyunsaturated fatty acids that occurs in the cow's stomach by the rumen microbes. This is accomplished by the rumen microbes. And it means that milk is characteristically high in saturated fatty acids. And another fatty acid that's present in milk is stearic acid, and that's C18. And it comes from the hydrogenation of the high levels of linoleic acid and linolenic acid that are present in a cow's diet. And for example, they're very high in grass, fresh grazed grass, okay? So the fatty acid profile is very much affected by the diet. So again, just to review, why would we want to feed fat to dairy cows? Historically, increasing the diet energy density to try to increase milk yield. We may want to alter milk fat concentration. That may be in terms of increasing milk fat yield or decreasing milk fat yield. Or we may want to alter milk fat composition to produce a niche product, a healthy milk, or to alter processing characteristics and perhaps to produce spreadable butter, like Marks and Spencer's spreadable butter that's produced during the springtime in Northern Ireland. It's about 30 producers. It's at spring turnout. They add rapeseed to the diet, and they also add naked oats, which are high in unsaturated fats. They then pool the milk, produce a lot of butter, and they can store it and sell it all year round, okay? So that's a good example of a naturally produced softer butter that's had its milk composition altered. You may want to be doing this to try to make cows more fertile or more healthy. I won't talk about that a lot. Another reason a lot of people are interested in feeding fat to dairy cows, and it's one reason we've been doing a lot of this work in the last 10 years, is fat is very good at reducing methane production from dairy cows. Okay, so there's a lot of interest in feeding fat to dairy cows to reduce methane production. Okay, and this is just an example. This comes from a meta-analysis of a number of studies where increasing amounts of fat have been added to diets, and you can see the effect of in terms of methane produced per unit dry matter intake going from 100 down to almost 40% in some cases. There are a lot of commercial fat supplements that are available that you can buy to feed to your cows. And the types of supplements have changed dramatically in the last 10 years or so. Megalac was one of the first supplements on the market. It's a calcium salt of palm fatty acid distillate. So it's palm fatty acids that have been turned into soap to make them less reactive in the rumen. So to try to avoid them being biohydrogenated in the rumen. So they've been rumen protected. It's not complete, the rumen protection. They still have effects in the rumen, but it's reasonably inert. And that's, again, it's palm fatty acid, so it's mostly C16, but it also has some oleic acid, C18-1, and some stearate and linoleic acid. Another popular fat supplement, certainly in North America, is Energy Booster. It's based on tallow. It's really high in C18-0, or stearic acid. We now have lots of these other fatty acid supplements, including Megalac R for reproduction, which have different blends of fatty acids in them for specific purposes. And these particular ones are all about boosting fat concentration. So they're much higher in palmitate, C16. The average effects of Megalac were looked at across a number of studies a few years ago. Feeding about a pound, this is North America, so feeding about a pound a day, increased milk yield by about 2.5 kilograms, slightly increased milk fat concentration, but reduced milk protein concentration, okay? More recently, this is another meta-analysis of published data looking at milk fat concentration changes in response to different types of fat supplements, and you can see the major effects of fish oil. And this is related to the production of specific trans fatty acids in the rumen that inhibit milk fat synthesis by the mammary gland when these unsaturated fats are fed. But you can see saturated fats and protected fats that they're protected from rumen metabolism tend to increase milk fat concentration, where free oils, and again fish oil, tend to reduce milk fat concentration. So more recently, there's been another big meta-analysis of all the published studies on feeding different types of fats to dairy cows and the responses. And this just shows and it varies dramatically depending on the type of diet you fed, the production of your cows, what stage of lactation they're in. But overall, all these different types of fat supplements, going from tallow, Megalac, oil seeds, these are just intact oil seeds that haven't had their oil extracted. They're just crushed, perhaps, to make them more digestible. And they're a good source of fat in dairy rations. Prilled fats, which are the high palm products, and then other calcium salts. They all increase milk yield with quite a bit of variation. In terms of milk fat concentration, they either increase it if they're the prilled fats or decrease it in the case of other salts of fatty acids. But in terms of milk protein concentration, they all reduce milk protein concentration. And so this is a particular issue in terms of cheese making characteristics. They will decrease milk fat concentration. We can talk about why if you're interested. And then finally, just a word about the potential effects of these fat supplements on the body energy balance of the cow. We've known for years that the response of cows in early lactation to the fat supplements varies, and it doesn't always result in an improvement in body condition. In fact, some fat supplements actually cause cows to milk more, produce more milk fat, and actually lose more body condition. And this comes from some work that was done by Adam Locke, who's a scientist at Michigan State University. He's actually a dairy farmer's son from Devon. He did his degrees at Nottingham. And he's actually unraveled why this happens. And it's related to the fatty acid composition of the supplements. So here he's got a palm-based fat supplement, a stearate-based fat supplement, and then Megalac, which is palm and oleic acid. And when you the short and the short answer to all this is that if you have high C16 in your fat supplement, the cows are going to produce more milk fat, more milk energy, and they're going to probably lose more body energy in early lactation. Whereas a product like Megalac that's higher in oleic acid, it tends to cause the cows to retain more body energy. So if you want your cows to not lose as much body fat, feed them a high oleic fat supplement in early lactation. And that's the gist of this work. And Adams published some of this. They had a review in the Farmer's Weekly that talked about the different effects of these different types of fatty acids. And again, oleic acid tends to increase body energy balance, and palmitic acid tends to increase milk fat output. Okay? And the concern about stearic acid, or C18, is it's not very digestible. So the cows don't get as much energy from it. So we did some work a long time ago at Reading looking at oilseeds as potential fat supplements for dairy cows. And we fed two forms of rapeseed. I'll just call your attention to this. One is just a full-fat rapeseed that's been crushed. We crushed it in a roller mill. You can use a hammer mill. And then an extruded rape product that BOC and Paul's was selling at the same time. And we compared that to whole cottonseed as a fat supplement or Megalac. And all of these treatments increase milk yield in these cows. They also change milk fatty acid concentration. And by the way, crushed rapeseed is a really good fat supplement for dairy cows. I highly recommend it. But what these supplements did was they increased the C18 fatty acids and decreased the medium chain saturated fatty acids that are the major concern in terms of human health. They also increased the oleic acid concentration, but particularly the rapeseed. And this then led us to do a lot more work on feeding rapeseed to dairy cows. And it's also related to what I referred to earlier in terms of these softer butter products. And in both cases, these two products are produced by feeding cows rapeseed. Okay? So the rapeseed is unsaturated, and the unsaturated fatty acids have a lower melting point, so they're softer at room temperature. And this isn't new knowledge. People have been working on the effects of cow's diet on milk composition for yonks for over 100 years, 150 years. And Kirschgessner published a book in 1967 summarizing the knowledge of the day on the effects of diet of cows on milk fat composition. And it's an excellent book. A lot of what we're doing today is just repeating what people did in the 1940s and the 1920s even, in terms of the manipulation of milk fat composition. And I highly recommend this book. And Kirschgessner showed that if you look at iodine value or iodine number, which is related to the degree of unsaturation, so the higher the iodine binding capacity of the fat, the more unsaturated it is. And so in the summertime, milk is naturally higher in iodine value because it has lower saturates. And again, you produce softer butter by feeding cows fresh grass in the summertime. And he looked at the hardness of butter, fat, and iodine value. Again, this is the 1950s, this work. And the very soft butter is going to be produced in the summertime when iodine value is much higher. And this is related to these changes in milk fatty acid composition that I was referring to. And he was reporting from the 1950s effects of summer feeding on things like conjugated linoleic acid, which a lot of people in the organic and free-range milk producing world are talking about now in terms of effects of feeding cows on fresh grass and the benefits in terms of some of these trans fatty acids, and particularly conjugated linoleic acid, which is purported to have a lot of health benefits for humans. And you'd see a lot of labeling of products as being enriched in some of these compounds, or some of these fatty acids. But a lot of the work we've done at Reading, again, has been around reducing the saturated fatty acid concentration of the diet. And my colleague Kirsty Kleems summarized a number of studies that have been conducted, a lot of these by us at Reading, showing that as you increase the amount of oil, and this is largely rapeseed oil in the diet, that the concentration of saturated fatty acids tend to decrease and the concentration of unsaturated fatty acids concomitantly increases. And so I wanted to show you some data from some work we did, which gets to the issue of cheese quality finally, which is from a project that they've just finished. It's a collaborative project with our colleagues in human nutrition, funded by the Medical Research Council, looking at the potential benefits of producing reduced saturated fatty acid concentration dairy products. And so we produced a number of dairy products by feeding cows supplemental rapeseed oil. It was in this case, it was high oleic sunflower oil. Most of our previous work had been with rapeseed oil. And so we fed cows diets to decrease the saturated fatty acid concentration. We then produced butter, UHT milk, cheddar cheese. Now, it wasn't an artisan cheddar cheese, but it was a reasonably edible cheddar cheese. And so, I think I mentioned butter. And then they were used for a human intervention trial. So people were paid to consume these modified fats relative to a control fat. And then we looked at indicators of cardiovascular health in those subjects. And we also did a consumer acceptance study for those modified products. Okay? So again, it was high oleic sunflower oil that was added to the cow's diet for 28 days. We then harvested the milk, harvested a control milk, and then produced the butter, the cheese, and the UHT milk. This is just showing the effects of the diet on the concentration of saturated fatty acids, oleic acid, and also trans monounsaturated fatty acids in the milk. So you can see we had a big reduction in saturated fatty acid concentration, an increase in the C18-1 monounsaturated fatty acids. This is the production of the cheddar cheese. So it was aged for 4 months. Again, it's not an artisan cheese. But we then did some consumer acceptance studies with trained taste panels for these dairy products. And this is just showing, I'll summarize all this in just a minute, but just to show that we had a modified and a control product, and then we had some normal commercial products just that were purchased as proof, just for comparison as comparators to our modified and controlled products. So this included a commercial full-fat cheddar that was purchased and then included in the taste studies. So there was no effect on the acceptability of the milk, the UHT milk, but both the cheese and the butter were significantly affected. And purchase intent was numerically reduced, and texture was significantly reduced in terms of the acceptability of the texture of that modified cheddar. So they did a full analysis in terms of looking at all these different characteristics of the taste of these cheeses, and just to emphasize, a lot of it was to do with texture. So the reduced saturate, the more unsaturated, the cheese that contained more unsaturated fatty acids, it was more rubbery, okay, and it was softer. We've done some other work with a major food company, Northern Foods, who looked at some of these reduced saturate cheeses for potential use in some of their pizzas and ready meals, and they found it was too oily. When you cooked it, there was too much oil that appeared on the surface of the cheese with these modified cheeses. Okay? So overall, there was no significant differences for the milk samples. The modified cheeses, though, were significantly less liked than a regular commercial alternative, and sort of less liked for the control versus the modified cheddar that was produced in our food science department. I would say, though, that when we unblinded the cheeses and labeled the cheeses, with the modified cheese being more healthy, the likely to purchase score was higher for the modified cheese. So when the taste panel knew that the cheese was healthier, they were more likely to buy it. Okay? So labeling, and I will say this with all our years of work in this area, labeling is everything. What you can say or what you can imply is everything in terms of these modified milk products. Okay? And then finally, if I've got time still, Bronwyn, just a word about fat globule size. And this is something I'd never thought about until Bronwyn asked me about the effects of feeding fat on cheese quality. And I think it's really important. Okay, so again, back to Kirschgessner. He showed that milk fat globule size is affected by breed of the cow and by the diet of the cow. Okay? And I've never heard of a black spotted or an angler cow, but perhaps you have. These are German cows. But you can see that the fat globule distribution across these three sizes is different for the two breeds, and it changes between summer and winter feeding. Okay? So diet and breed have major effects on milk fat globule size, and supplemental fat and forage to concentrate ratio also affect milk fat globule. size. And it's really related to the amount of fat. So we know Jersey cattle genetically produce more milk fat. It's largely due to more saturated fat, and their fat is produced with a larger milk fat globule. Okay, so they're more, and so milk fat concentration and size is positively correlated. It's also related to the degree of saturation of the fat globule. So if you have a higher saturated fatty acid concentration, it's usually associated with larger milk fat globules. And so this is important because those larger, and I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know, but the larger milk fat globules are more fragile. And they have a greater risk of mechanical disruption and mechanical hydrolysis, which releases the free fatty acids from the triglyceride, and they're more liable to be oxidized and to become rancid. And I was told 30 years ago that Jersey producers, one of the issues with Jersey milk is driving around lots of different farms with a tanker that's half full of Jersey milk that's sloshing around, and it causes the milk fat globules to disrupt. Okay, and it's a real issue for people that are purchasing Jersey or Channel Island milks. Okay, so there's more mechanical disruption. And there's work, I haven't gone into all this, but there's just 2 papers that I found where a cheddar type cheese made with larger milk fat globule milk had higher concentrations of free fatty acids after storage. Okay? And the other study showed that a camembert made with larger milk fat globules was more firm and had a longer storage potential. So it depends on the type of cheese in terms of the potential effects of that milk fat globule size, and then ultimately how feeding fat may have affected milk fat globule size, how that impacts on cheese quality. I think it's going to depend on the type of cheese that you're producing. Okay, so to summarize, feeding fat supplements, it typically will increase milk yield. It may not, but in most cases it does. Whether that benefits your cow's tissue energy balance, whether it's going to help her lose less body condition in early lactation, it's going to depend on the type of fat. If you feed a high palm fat supplement, it's not going to help that. Milk protein concentration, and this is largely casein concentration, will definitely be reduced, okay? Usually by, 1.5, something like that percent. Milk fat concentration, the response varies with the type of fat fed, but again, palmitate products, things like a butter booster, it's called butter booster because it will increase milk fat concentration. Feeding fat reduces methane emissions, just throw that out there. But the milk fatty acid profile, it's affected by basal diet, whether the cows are grazing fresh grass or being fed silage, and the type of the fat that we feed. So it really does reflect the fatty acid profile of the fat supplement, although the rumen microorganisms will change the structure of those fatty acids depending on the extent to which those fat supplements have their fatty acids protected from the rumen environment or not. But typically feeding processed oil seeds reduces saturated fats and increases cis and trans monounsaturated fatty acids. So in our taste panel work, consumer acceptance of a low saturated fatty acid and higher monounsaturated fatty acid cheddar was less than for a commercial brand, but it was then more acceptable when it was labeled as being healthy. It had a softer and more oily texture, and so this effect on acceptability will vary with cheese type. And then feeding supplemental fat can affect milk fat globule size. Those larger milk fat globules are more fragile, and they resulted in more free fatty acids in a cheddar. The smaller milk fat globules were associated with a less firm camembert. So this really has implications, I think, for physical characteristics of cheese. So thank you very much. I hope that wasn't too much.